For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. I am your host, Jade Black, and today we're doing another sort of more craft-based episode about editing. And this was an episode I wanted originally to do sooner, but I've just been doing so much editing that honestly I just didn't want to talk about it. But I feel it's relevant having done the SparkPit episode because I was in such an editing hole during all the prep for SparkPit. So, I don't know, it feels relevant at the moment for some reason, even though I've actually not edited anything for a while, which feels nice, but anyhow. Before we get into this, I'm going to deliver my usual preamble of, I am not here to give writing advice, or in this case, editing advice. I'm here to talk about my craft, my process, what works for me, all of that. Let's talk about handwriting a little bit, and I do have an entire episode dedicated to handwriting. That was one of my really early ones. And I want to talk in particular about why handwriting has really sped up my editing process, because one thing is I am a slow drafter compared to a lot of people. Like, I'm not cranking out 3 words a day every day unless I'm writing the end of Snakebite and giving myself some amount of like permanent wrist damage. I don't think it's actually permanent. It's mostly gone now, but you know, we're months and months later and I still get the old weird twinge. So, you know, word of caution about handwriting too fast, it's actually not good for you. But that drafting slower and the fact that handwriting does just take physically longer, forming letters, forming words, all of those sorts of things, it stops me lazy drafting. Because every time I try to draft things digitally, and I did do this relatively recently for an AU that it's never going to see the light of day, more than likely, the lazy drafting in that is just abysmal. It's so bad. Like, I don't know if I can ever face looking at it again. Like, it's that bad. And if I handwrite, I don't do that in the same way because it takes that bit longer, like literally a couple of seconds longer to write a sentence because I handwrite really, really fast. You get the right words in the right places and little bits of dialogue tags and action things that it's all there straight away. You don't miss that in the same way, or I don't. And all it means is my first drafts, and this is something I've really worked on over the years, my first drafts are really tidy. Like, don't get me wrong, there are bits I get wrong, and, you know, time breaks I've missed. I know I missed 2 weeks in Beneath the Moon really early, and I'm not looking forward to having to work that out. But in terms of how much editing needs to be done, it ain't that much, generally. And when it comes to handwriting as well, no more Frankendrafts, strictly linear. I did talk about this in the Getting Unstuck episode that may or may not be uploaded yet, because, I mean, we all know that there's no plan for this podcast. But yeah, writing linear does also really, really help with this, for me, for consistent characters and all of those sorts of things. Frankendraft, you thank you. So a couple of really early things I do to help with editing is I want to talk a bit about the 1.1 draft, because this is something I mentioned in the SparkPit episode and I'm not sure I've mentioned it before and actually explained what that is. So the first draft is obviously handwritten. Then the 1.1 draft is the typed up version of the first draft, because there will be things I change as I go because I've realised I've used but 3 times in the same sentence or things like that. It's like incredibly like just super, super light edits. Like they don't really even count, generally speaking. But that's the 1.1 draft, and I keep a copy of that for one specific reason, and that is dialogue. Because one of the passes I always do, and I'll come on to this later, is about dialogue. And then if I decide later, when I'm going back to line edits, actually no, I want to bring that dialogue back, it'll be there in the 1.1 draft. And there are other things like that too, where if I overcut things and it's like, oh wait, there's that scene, I can bring that back, and it's all there, and I don't have to go ploughing through handwritten pages trying to find things, because that does take a while. I have had to do that, and it ain't fun, and that's why I keep 1.1 drafts now. I've learned from my mistakes. So let's talk a little bit about editing an underwritten draft versus editing an overwritten draft, because generally speaking, I am a terrible underwriter, as in the first draft of Black Executioner was 57k, but I have overwritten things more recently. So Miss Nakagami was like 110 or some dumb shit, and Snakebite was 81, which might not sound like an overwrite, but with thrillers, you have to be careful. I mean, yes, that's a political thriller, so you can get away with things being longer, but still, you have to be really careful about overwriting and word counts with thrillers. Not that Shranpub seem to want to accept that, but that's maybe an episode for another time. But yeah, underwritten drafts and overwritten drafts do follow a different process from the very beginning, and that is about what you've missed, because with underwriting, for me, what that means is I've missed a ton of shit, and a lot of the early editing process and a lot of the 1.1 draft stage, I'll leave comments myself about, okay, there's an entire 2 weeks missing here. Something happened at this point. I don't believe that in the novel this fast pace, that in this 3 weeks nothing significant happened. What you doing? Fix that, please. Whereas in overwritten, I'll be saying, is this scene really necessary? Is this scene necessary? And it's probably 50-50 whether it is, and sometimes I'll cut that if I just think, okay, this isn't needed, doesn't really add anything, let's just get rid of that. If it's a scene I really like, I'll often keep it, and then I'll realise a bit later on when I'm doing a bit more deeper analysis, oh yeah, that's actually a really important character moment, or this, or that. It matters a lot of the time. It's a bit of a gut feeling thing. So let's talk about the detail of my editing process, because having talked to a few other writers, I know I don't do this the same. I don't know that any two people edit the same, to be fair, but I do have some differences with them. So there are a lot of writers who talk about, okay, I go on to chapter 1, I edit the full thing to chapter 1 until chapter 1 is perfect, then I go to chapter 2, which is still in first draft. I have tried to do that, and oh boy, no. That's, again, one of the reasons why Pentiment was such a mess, because I tried to follow that kind of process. And over the years, I did actually do this for Black Executioner as well, back in the day. I found that doesn't work for me. And instead, in terms of keeping things consistent, especially with how tidy my drafts are now, and I think for me it's a bit of how my brain works and mentality and paying attention to particular things, particular points. For me, what works as a person doing a project, any kind of big project, be that game dev, art, or writing, anything, I work best in batches. So let's take a game as an example. I want to do all the concept art in one go, all the concepting, I want all of that done in one go. Then I'll move on to things like level blockouts, and then I'll move on to modelling, and I'll do all the modelling and all the texturing and all of that all in one big go. And then, if I have to add bits and pieces later, I'm okay with that, because that's just sort of, even then, if it's, okay, I need to add 3 models, 2 audio cues, I need to concept this one thing, I need concept art for that, that will all still be done in batches, just smaller batches. And effectively, I've made that into my editing process as well. So I do one pass per issue I have. And depending on exactly how the draft is and everything, these passes will take more and less time, and sometimes I will actually skip a pass if I just know that there's no issue with that through typing up the 1.1 draft, or if I've just done one pass, I'll think, actually, okay, this other thing isn't a problem, I can just skip that pass this time, which is a great feeling, but it's very, very rare for what it's worth. And the first pass I always do, and this is really where the overwritten and underwritten drafts, the differences between that ends very quickly with the missing scenes pass, because there will always be at least one scene that I miss. That I will have to go back and redraft, and I prefer to do that straight away, so that then everything is, basically first draft, it's consistent. Sometimes I will draft this digitally, just for the sake of, okay, actually, there is no space left in the Miss Nakagami notebook, like, at all, as in I wrote on the inside of the back cover to actually get everything down. For Black Executioner and Snakebite, I did have spare pages, so that was handwritten, and the drafts of those were a bit tidier. But that is the first thing I will do every time, get the story in order first, because then I don't need to worry about it ever again, pretty much. And then the next thing is endings of scenes, because this is something I've noticed more recently. I'm terrible for just either not ending scenes and just be like, okay, this is where the end of the significant stuff happens, so I'll just never mind about that last paragraph or that last couple of sentences here. That was really bad in Snakebite, and I knew that at first draft. I was like, I'm being really lazy with the scene endings. And a lot of the time, this does kind of come into paragraphing a bit as well, because the first thing that goes out the window if I'm getting really into paragraphing, and again, I've just had this problem with Shadow on the Snow, is I don't fucking paragraph anything. With Shadow on the Snow, I know for a fact I've just written 3 pages of A5 with no paragraphing at all, and it's going to be horrendous to look at in the future, but yeah. But I'm very bad for knowing where scene endings are and all of that first draft. I'm really bad at that, so that's something that gets fixed, again, very quickly, just so I don't have to worry about it. And it's a point where generally beyond that point I don't have to write that much more copy, which is nice. Well, I say that, but I haven't done the description pass yet, so that's not really true. The pass I do next is dialogue, because I have a bad habit of writing too much dialogue, and that might sound a bit, excuse me, do you know what a novel is? But what I mean is, I'll have a scene that goes on for a page and a bit that just has one random ass line of dialogue in the middle of it. It's like, okay, that just does not need to be dialogue. Just make that reported speech. It looks weird, and B, it reads weird. It's interrupted, and there can be a lot of stuff like that. Just pointless conversations. Just like, oh yes, we said good morning, how are you? It's like, you don't, just no. Just cut that and say we exchanged pleasantries or something. We don't need that. It's a bad habit of mine. And that is partly because a lot of stuff comes about in dialogue and conversations, in real life. So it happens that way in fiction. A lot of the time I don't know how when do I ever know how a conversation is going to go? And what's going to come up and all of that. So it's kind of, it's one of those things you can't necessarily fix. And then after that, after almost everything is in order, then I go on to the description pass, because again, I've mentioned this several times on Twitter, though maybe not on the podcast. I don't write description in first draft. This is something I have worked on, but I'm bad for description. I don't write it first draft. I definitely don't describe things enough. I've been working on it. I'm getting better at, making sure that at least the important people have descriptions first draft, at least to some extent. I'm that bad. But in terms of, is any location described first draft? At all? Besides, once I'm past the 10k mark, the chance that any key location is described in any way, shape, or form past the 10k mark in a first draft for me is like 5%. It's really bad. So that pass usually takes a while in terms of, okay, but I need to describe this room, or okay, actually, I'm realizing now at the end of the book I have not described the love interest once. I don't know what colour their eyes are or any, well, because again, a lot of this is because it's just so obvious to me that I has black hair and black eyes for all intents and purposes, and they're like, oh, do I really need to specify this? Like, yes, actually you do, because if it's, in the eyes of the desert, we haven't, and that's the first book someone picks up, but you haven't seen Eye before, then actually knowing what he looks like would be nice. It is. I find it funny reading that back sometimes, being like, oh yeah, I just didn't ever describe that person. Then after that, we get onto overused words, and while I'm typing up the 1.1 draft, I'll actually make a list of words I think I've overused. So there are a few that are common, so but is one that I always overuse every single time, without fail. But it does vary a bit with project, and this is a character voice thing. As much as anything else, someone will use one word a lot, and then I'm okay, I need to watch for that. And it should be noted a lot of the time I'm really oversensitive for that, so I'll have like 2 pages of them and I'll be like, oh my fucking god. And then I'll do the search and be like, I've used this word literally 5 times. 5. That is not overusing. And I don't know, again, whether this is because so much editing has been done by then that I've sort of done that as I go at least a little bit and things have been cut, but there are definitely times where I'm oversensitive. And then the final pass I do is line edits. And what I do for that is I read aloud. And that really helps me catch any clunky phrasing or missed commas, because I'm one of the weird writers that doesn't use enough commas for some reason. And I forget that actually if you've got a sentence that's like 50 words, there needs to be a comma in there somewhere at some point, so that you don't die reading it. So, and that's it, really. I do the 1.1 draft, which doesn't really count as a pass. That's actually just, reading what I've written. And then I do 6 passes, and that's it. Now, this is something, again, that I've learned over time, is that doing 20 passes or 30 passes or 50 passes, there's a line, and this will vary for everybody, that actually doing another pass is only going to make things worse. It's not going to help, because you're just going to second guess everything. This was a real problem I had with Penston, was just over editing, and then actually having to go back and just redo things and do things correctly. There's a line, and for me, doing more than 6, it's just not. It's not going to help me. So let's talk about some little techniques I use and things I watch for with edits. And there are a couple of things I have touched on before on this podcast, but details and all that. So one thing I do watch for, and I do increasingly notice this first draft as well, is chapter lengths. And this, I'm being really bad for it in Shadow on the Snow already, that I think just about every chapter I've written is at least 10k in Shadow on the Snow. And I think I did mention this with Mr. Nakagami, that in first draft, the penultimate chapter was 23,000 words on its own, one chapter. And I don't mind, long chapters. I'm okay with, 9k chapters, like, I'm cool with that. And I'm okay with short chapters. I mean, I'm a little bit funnier about those. But, like, there's a line where you think, okay, this... at some point we need a break in here, this is ridiculous. And whether I noticed that first draft or not is very much debatable. So with Mr. Nakagami, I genuinely didn't realise. And when I was going through the 1.1 draft, I was like, good fucking god, where does this chapter end? I was thinking, I must have missed the mark, I must have missed it. And then when I finally did eventually come across the last chapter, I was like, no, wait, that is the number I expected it to be. Okay. And I didn't notice with Shadow on the Snow until I hit chapter 2, and I was like, hang on, I'm at the 20k mark. And I'm on chapter 2. Oh boy. So yeah, that was fun. Chapter titles, and I have touched on this in the chapter titles episode, chapter titles do not get decided until the edit stage, and generally not until I'm probably done with line edits or doing them. Because I don't do chapter titles very well in first draft, it generally doesn't work. I'm trying to do it with Shadow on the Snow for some reason, but I'm probably gonna stop doing it after like the next couple chapters, to be honest. But yeah, that doesn't get decided until really late, because I feel like it's only once you get that deep of an understanding that it works, because chapter titles are... they're just so, again, hyper-specific to what they are that until then it can be really difficult. So, technique I use, and this is particularly prevalent for me in the dialogue pass, is really fucking ugly highlighting. And if you are watching the accompanying video, you will see the horrific shade of salmon pink I use for dialogue. When I do the dialogue pass, I highlight every single piece of dialogue in the entire book before I do anything else. So the entire document is just covered in this fucking horrible salmon pink, and it motivates me to cut bits of dialogue that I don't need because I don't want to look at the colour. I'm not being funny, this is a genuine thing I do, and do it with overused words as well. I'll search the word, and then I'll highlight it in some really fucking ugly colour, because then I want to get rid of it. And I recommend that technique. It works. And one thing I do want to bring up last is that editing is really when the imposter syndrome bites me, especially when, I'm reading back through the 1.1 draft for all the missing scenes, and I'm like, oh, these early chapters are really clumsy. Line edits are really bad for that too. Because, the first chapter is never going to be amazing. You read the first chapter and you think, oh my god, this is just really clumsy, what am I even doing? And that's when the imposter syndrome really bites me, is early in edits. But I do love editing, because to me it's just so satisfying. It's like polishing something that's covered in dirt until it, you wash it under the tap, at first, maybe you have to scrub it a little bit, and then you dry it off, and you polish it, and you polish it, and you polish it until it shines, and it sparkles, and it's beautiful, and that whole process. And because changes can happen really quickly, at least the way I do it now, you get a very real sense of progress very quickly, because it's like, okay, well, I started today on page 40, and I'm ending today on page 100. I've done 60 pages of making scenes end correctly. And that really feels like a lot, and that's very rewarding. It's not just, okay, so chapter 1's now good, now I've got 19 chapters to go. That I felt, to me, really demotivating. I really hated that. So then it's like, okay, well, I started today on page 1, now I'm on page 100, and then you get that, a few times over. It's like, okay, well, I'll just do 10 more pages, I'll just do 10 more pages, and that can really help do it faster as well, because it can be, I find it a little bit addicting as well, even if, the line edit pass absolutely kills my voice. I've actively lost my voice doing line edits, staying up until 4 in the morning doing that, in the SparkPit prep days. Yes, genuinely, I stayed up until 4 in the morning doing it for Penstemon because I just couldn't stop. I'm healthy, I swear. I don't have issues. But I think that's about all I have for today. So we're going to move on to a couple of little ending plugs. I always do. If you are published or on the way, please do get in touch. Do that via email. Please don't via Twitter. There are still legacy episodes with all that. jade42black@gmail.com. There are a few things I want to know first. Please read the description and include all that. I don't want to give people automatic no's if and when I get inundated. It's no good for me, and it's no good for you, obviously. If you are indie or self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from. If you're trad pub, that doesn't necessarily mean I won't talk to you, for what it's worth. It doesn't have to be adult literature, it doesn't have to be a novel, it doesn't have to be a particular genre, just bring in whatever you have. I'd be really interested to talk about people who do completely different stuff to me. Because I learn things that way. And if you're looking to find me elsewhere, if you're looking for the home of the podcast in particular, that is Instagram, Jade_Black21 on there. If you go to Instagram to the podcast home, you'll find early teasers of what episodes will be, little snippets, soundbite reels, things like that. If you're looking for the home of my writing, that's Twitter, JadeBlack21. But that is about all for now, so you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing so you don't miss future content. Copyright Jade Black 2023. I don't have issues. She says as a fucking writer.